Hey everybody. So implicit bias has been implicated in a wide variety of social problems, and probably the most famous of these is racial disparities. But besides racial disparities, it's also been implicated in things like addiction, drinking problems, impulsive eating, and so forth. So perhaps because of this potential influence, there's been widespread calls for effective interventions to reduce implicit bias. And in particular, implicit bias is concerning because of its potential to influence people's behavior despite their intentions. And a wide variety of bodies have issued these calls, including the National Academies of Sciences, the National Institute of Health, and so forth. So since the mid-90s, we've had an accelerating rate of this kind of research to produce strategies to reduce implicit bias. And by now, there are literally hundreds of studies investigating this topic. So that leads to the question, which interventions are available? And do we have some sort of overall scheme to think about those interventions? And then secondly, how well do they work? So my colleagues and I sought to address these problems through meta-analysis. And we defined as our studies of interest studies that included a measure of implicit bias. I'm going to come back to this later, but we also coded measures of behavior and explicit bias that were correspondent with the measure of implicit bias. All of our measures of implicit bias were measuring a pre-existing association. So this might be like black bad. So notably, our meta-analysis excludes studies of novel associations. And all of the measures are scored such that positive scores indicate the pre-existing association. They're all English studies. All the studies needed specific things in order for us to extract the information that we needed. They're all randomized. And all the studies had to have two different manipulations according to our coding scheme. So what this means is that in the results I'll present, we can't compare, for example, two different methods of doing perspective taking to see which one is more effective. We searched a wide variety of databases, including a database of dissertations to try to retrieve unpublished studies. These are our search criteria. Suffice it to say that they're relatively broad to get a broad range of the research that's available. We also attempted to directly request papers from different researchers, and we sent requests through the SPSP listserv. So this resulted in a sample of about 3,800 articles. We checked all the articles against our inclusion criteria, resulting in about 340 articles. We did our request to try to retrieve the information that we needed for the studies for which that wasn't available. Our final sample of articles then was about 270, representing almost 400 studies and almost 450 samples and 45,000 participants. So it's a pretty large sample. Let me tell you about the coding scheme that we use. So in our coding scheme, we specifically try to avoid coding what the researchers' predictions are about whether their manipulations would be effective. Instead, we are coding procedures. So what this means is that two different researchers who maybe disagree about whether a manipulation is effective, if those manipulations were procedurally similar, would go into the same category. The first general category is what I'm going to call pairing-congruent, pair-congruent. What this means is pairing one set of concepts with a thing that is incongruent with the pre-existing association. So probably the most famous of this might be something like counter-stereotypic exemplars. This condition would be categorized as pairing-congruent because the attribute is incongruent with the association. This one would be pair-congruent. A very similar type of manipulation is kind of an indirect version of pair-congruent, pairing-congruent. What indirect means is that let's assume that someone is using a black, white, good, bad IIT. instead of directly pairing black with good, you might pair black with something that might be related to good, but isn't directly representing good. So a good example of this is perspective taking. If you're using a black, white, good, bad IAT, perspective taking should increase self-other overlap. People generally have positive associations with self, so this is indirectly pairing black with good. The next general category are rules manipulations. This is pretty broad. Probably the most famous example is just giving people direct instructions to try to exhibit a certain response on the implicit measure. But I should note here that these manipulations vary pretty widely in how specific the instructions are. Sometimes the instructions were very specific, and sometimes they were rather indirect, such as making norms salient if you are doing a race IAT. The next general category is threat. This involves things like a true or social stress task. It could also involve things like stereotype threat. The next category is affirmation. These were generally values affirmation manipulations. Mood manipulations, depletion, which consists of completing, say, a cognitively taxing task. So I'd like to give you a general sense of what our sample studies were like. One of the nice things about doing a meta-analysis is that you can get a nice sense of where the field is at. And in terms of the participant samples that people used, the vast majority of them were students, 88%, and the general demographics reflects the typical representation of introductory psychology classrooms. In terms of measures, the majority of the measures that people used were evaluation attitudes, so good, bad. But there were a fair number of cognitions, self-cognitions, and that sort of thing. 2/3 of the studies used the IAT, and only 5% of the studies involved a longitudinal component, so had any measurements after the initial session. Most of the studies were conducted in the United States. Most of the studies were also prejudice and stereotyping studies. And this last characteristic is something that is important for the meta-analysis. Many of these studies are multi-group studies, so they're not just comparing one manipulation to a control group, they're comparing maybe many manipulations together. The implication of this is that we couldn't use a standard meta-analysis technique for this project. Instead, we had to use something called network meta-analysis. I'm not going to go into all the details, but I will give you just a broad sense of what this means. So in a standard meta-analysis, you might have one group versus a control group. You have a bunch of studies that follow that general design. You calculate the effect size, and those are what you're analyzing in the meta-analysis. What a network meta-analysis allows you to do is, say you have a 3-group study. Instead of just calculating one effect size, you choose a reference group, which might be, the control group, and you calculate 2 effect sizes. And then you do some special procedures to account for the fact that these 2 effect sizes are dependent on each other. They're using the same comparison group. If people are interested, I'd be happy to discuss more about this. There's some subtleties I'm just not going to go into. All right, so I'd like you to give you a kind of visual sense of what these studies are like, which studies have been compared to each other, which groups are most prevalent in our sample. What I'm showing you is a network plot. Each of these circles represents the number of groups that were randomized to that category. So as you can see, in our studies, most of the most widely represented group was a neutral comparison group. Kind of makes sense. Each of these lines represents the number of comparisons, the number of studies that directly compared, say, a neutral control group with a paired incongruent manipulation. So one of the features that comes out to me about this network plot is that in the vast majority of these studies, people are comparing one group to a neutral control group. And when people do make other types of comparisons between the different types of groups, it's usually one group with its conceptual opposite. So, say, a paired congruent manipulation with a paired congruent manipulation. There's not a lot of connections between groups of different categories. I'll show you the general broad results of the meta-analysis. So this is going to be a forest plot. The axis represents the Cohen's d as compared to a neutral control group. So parent congruent versus neutral control. Negatives represent reduction in the active group versus the neutral control group in a pre-existing tendency. Positives represent increase. So there are a couple features about this forest plot that jump out to me anyway. If you look at parent congruent and parent congruent, the effect sizes are relatively symmetric, about 0. So minus 0.2, positive 0.25. But if you look at parent congruent indirect versus parent congruent indirect, the parent incongruent indirect has an effect size that's about twice the magnitude of parent congruent indirect. I'm not sure exactly why this is. It could be that because there are a lot of perspective taking manipulations went into this category, there isn't really a good conceptual offset that works well for that kind of manipulation. One of the nice things about meta-analysis, of course, is that you can look at potential moderators of the effects. There are a ton that I could show you. I'm just going to focus on 2. The first one is the type of measure that people use, specifically whether people use an IIT versus a non-IIT. And what we see for this analysis is that for some of the categories, the effect size for IIT studies is pretty similar for the effect size on non-IIT studies. But for many of these studies, the effect size for IIT studies is actually larger than it is for non-IIT studies. And that's a fairly consistent pattern across the data with a few exceptions like parent congruent. The next moderator I'll show you is whether the study was a prejudice versus a non-prejudice study. For many of these categories, the prejudice effect sizes look fairly similar, but there are a few rather startling exceptions like threat, and also parent congruent indirect. Next, I'll show you an analysis of the consistency between implicit bias, effects on implicit bias and behavior. And of course, this matters because for a lot of people, this is one of the reasons to be interested in implicit bias. First, let me just note that there was a much smaller sample of studies that included the behavioral measure, and there were fewer connections in between the different categories for the subsample. We obtained the average correlation in these studies between attitudes and behavior, and I just want to note that it's relatively low in the sample, about 0.08. And consistent with that, in general, the effects on implicit bias were not consistent with the effects on behavior. There are a few exceptions, like the difference between implicit and behavioral is there but small for parent congruent. But there are a few cases where, in fact, the effects are even in opposite directions. So parent congruent, indirect, and threat. There's a lot more that we could do with these data, but I'd like to offer a few provisional conclusions based on what I've shown you so far. The first thing is that implicit bias is malleable. I mean, I don't think that should surprise anybody in the audience, but I can confidently state this based on about 4 other studies. However, there are a few caveats. First of all, most of our data to date comes from student samples, about 88%. And secondly, very few studies, only 5%, have bothered to track these effects longitudinally. And in fact, of the 5%, I think 18 of the 20 just did a 24-hour follow-up and didn't go beyond that. And finally, how effective a manipulation appears to be depends on the implicit measure used. I'm not going to make any bold claims about why there was a difference between the IIT and the non-IIT measures, but it is true that most of the time the effects on the IIT were larger than the effects on the other types of measures. There are also a few conceptual caveats. So the first one is that the effectiveness of manipulation depends on the content of it. So I showed you that, at least for a couple of these manipulations, there were pretty large differences between the effects in the prejudice versus non-prejudice studies. I think this means that there probably isn't a one-size-fits-all manipulation that is effective for all kinds of implicit bias. It's probably the case that certain manipulations are more effective in some domains than others. And the final conceptual caveat is that based on the data that I presented to you, based on at least where the field is now and what evidence we have right now, the effects on implicit bias do not necessarily generalize to behavior. So I'm going to echo Margot with using slightly different data. Based on the data that we have now, we can't necessarily assume that an effect on implicit bias will be reflected in behavior. I'd like to acknowledge all my collaborators. This was a pretty massive project, in particular Calvin Lai, who is the co-lead on this project. Thanks. Any questions? Yeah.
Just a quick clarification. Can you give an example of some non-prejudice studies? Like, are these very mundane attitude or what?
Sure. So one example might be there were several studies to try to promote alcohol cessation. So they might measure like alcohol approach associations to do approach avoidance training. There were also smoking cessation manipulations to reduce anxiety or social anxiety or depression. They really ran the gamut.
I think we're running on. Well.